Lillian Woods had never imagined that her pursuit of peace would lead her straight into the heart of a nightmare. After 2 grueling decades working in commercial architecture, surrounded by concrete jungles and boardroom compromises, she made the bold decision to leave city life behind. She'd long grown tired of deadlines that drained her spirit and clients who demanded beauty without soul. So, when a modest but character-rich property appeared in a quiet, leafy neighborhood a few hours outside of Atlanta, she didn't hesitate. It wasn't perfect, but it had potential. A 2-story colonial revival with faded shutters, a crooked porch swing, and a massive magnolia tree leaning like an old friend over the front lawn. It spoke to her in a way that glossy real estate never could. It felt like a place where she could finally build something that belonged only to her. She poured herself into the restoration. It was the kind of work that didn't pay in money, but in satisfaction. Every morning, before the sun crested the tree line, she was already sanding floorboards, resealing old windows, or sketching plans for the kitchen remodel she'd dreamt of for years. Her savings, though modest, were enough to cover the essentials. She refused to take out a renovation loan. The house wasn't an investment. It was home. Neighbors would pass by and wave, curious about the new woman on the block with dirt under her nails and calluses forming on her hands. She introduced herself politely but rarely lingered. She wasn't there to befriend anyone. She was there to heal, to work, and maybe, finally, to be still. Everything changed on a bitterly cold Sunday morning in February. Lillian was on her way back from the hardware store when she saw the smoke. Thick, black columns twisted up from her street like a warning signal, and with every turn she made, the sinking feeling in her chest grew heavier. By the time she pulled up to her property, it was too late. Flames had already engulfed the rear of the house. Fire crews were on the scene, but the structure was quickly losing the fight. Frozen in place, Lillian stood on the sidewalk, clutching a bag of brass cabinet pulls in one hand, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. In just under an hour, everything she'd built, everything she'd hoped to rebuild, was gone. The investigation was swift, but inconclusive. Electrical fault, most likely. The fire captain told her that older homes often carried hidden risks behind the walls. Dry rot, outdated wiring, years of neglect masked by a coat of paint. She listened, nodded, and signed the paperwork. No foul play, no clear cause, just bad luck, he said. She returned to the motel room she'd checked into temporarily and stared at the white ceiling, trying to understand how something so fragile could collapse so suddenly. She didn't cry. She just felt hollow. The house had been her second chance, her sanctuary. Now it was ash and rubble. What followed was even worse. Days later, while sifting through what little she'd salvaged, Lillian received a letter that made her stomach drop. It was from the local Property Management Council, the neighborhood's self-governing body that oversaw maintenance rules, land use, and, apparently, fines. According to them, Lillian owed $2,000 for neglect of property condition, specifically for failing to maintain a presentable and secure structure following a catastrophic event. At first, she thought it was a joke, a cruel, bureaucratic glitch, but when she called to dispute the charge, she was met with indifference and legal jargon. They cited Clause 4.3.1 of the Community Maintenance Ordinance. Homeowners must ensure rapid remediation of any significant damage that may affect surrounding property values. When she explained that the damage had occurred only days ago and was caused by a fire, not negligence, the woman on the phone simply responded, "You are still the responsible party, Ms. Woods. The fine stands." Staring at the letter in her hands, Lillian realized 2 things with chilling clarity. First, she was being punished for surviving a disaster. Second, the fire had destroyed more than just her home. It had exposed a system that was far more interested in appearances and control than in people. And, somehow, in the middle of her grief, she'd become their next target. The days that followed were not consumed by grief in the way Lillian had expected. She didn't find herself drowning in memories or sentiment. There was no room for that. Instead, she was thrust into a slow, grinding storm of phone calls, policies, and procedures that made her feel less like a human being and more like a number in a file. The insurance company, which had once confidently marketed itself as a protector in times of loss, began its retreat the moment Lillian submitted her claim. First came the questions, oddly specific ones, about the electrical system, permits, receipts, occupancy. Then came the delays. We're still reviewing. We've escalated your case. We're waiting on documentation from the county. She spent entire days on hold, being bounced between departments that all seemed vaguely sympathetic and entirely useless. Each interaction ended with the same sentiment. We'll be in touch. They rarely were. While the insurance dragged its feet, the $2,000 fine loomed like a ticking clock. It wasn't just a piece of mail anymore. It was a concrete deadline, a threat, a weight around her ankles. She called again, trying to explain the situation, but no one seemed to care that she was living out of a motel room with the contents of her life reduced to a backpack and a half-melted hard drive. The woman she finally reached at the office repeated the same thing she had heard before, only now with a thinly veiled impatience. You had 72 hours to begin remediation. Failure to secure the lot has resulted in secondary penalties. This is standard procedure. If you wish to appeal, you'll need to file the appropriate paperwork. No one seemed to care that she had no place to live, no access to documents that had burned, and no way to secure a structure that no longer existed. The appeals process, she soon learned, was a labyrinth, intentionally complex as if designed to make people give up before they even began. She printed forms at a library 20 minutes away, filled them out by hand, scanned them, and submitted them by email and by certified mail, just to be safe. No acknowledgement came. When she followed up, she was told her submission was missing supporting documentation. What documentation? She asked. Proof of hardship, the clerk replied. Photos of the damage, incident reports, a written statement, and documentation of your current housing. Photos from a phone that had been fried in the fire. Incident reports, which she had not received because she had been too stunned and passive to ask for them in the chaos. Proof of temporary housing, which meant she needed to beg the motel front desk to write her a letter. It was around that time Lillian realized something was wrong. Not just inefficient, not just cold and bureaucratic, but actively wrong. The letter she had received, the fine, the sudden and precise demand for remediation. All of it had come too quickly, too systematically. Most municipalities she had worked in took weeks or even months to process such issues. In her case, the notice had arrived within 4 days of the fire, already drafted, dated, and delivered. It was as if someone had been waiting for the house to fail, as if the fire had triggered a trap she hadn't even known was set. Out of growing suspicion, she started walking through the neighborhood, slowly, as if reintroducing herself to the area she once viewed as a peaceful retreat. Now it felt different. People didn't wave anymore. Some looked at her, others looked away. A few seemed startled to see her, as if they thought she'd left. She noticed one thing repeatedly. People avoided eye contact when she got too close, as if her tragedy was contagious, as if she'd done something wrong. One afternoon, while sitting on the sidewalk outside what used to be her home, she saw a woman standing across the street. The woman was dressed neatly, pressed slacks, a pastel blouse, sunglasses perched atop perfectly coiffed hair, and she was just standing there, not moving, not pretending to check her phone or water a plant. She was watching. Lillian stared back, tired of being polite, tired of pretending she hadn't noticed. The woman eventually turned and walked away, slowly, but without any sign of embarrassment. Later, Lillian learned her name was Margaret Connors, a longtime neighborhood resident, and one of the founding members of the local residential committee that had issued her fine. That night, unable to sleep, Lillian started researching Margaret. It was easy to find her name in public records, and easier still to find her involvement in a number of local beautification and code enforcement campaigns. The deeper Lillian dug, the more she found signs of a quiet but powerful movement within the neighborhood, one that had used fines, fees, and bureaucratic pressure to force out certain property owners over the years, sometimes for overgrown grass, sometimes for code violations, sometimes for things as petty as paint color. The victims were often retirees, single homeowners, or people who had recently fallen on hard times. Each case followed a pattern: pressure, penalties, confusion, and eventually a sale. In most cases, the properties were later flipped and resold at a profit. But something else caught her attention. In more than one instance, the properties had changed hands under suspiciously fast timelines, like hers. Properties would be damaged by storms, by fire, or in one case by what was listed as a minor incident of vandalism. And within days, penalties would be issued. In some cases, the owners gave up. In others, they tried to fight and lost in administrative hearings they didn't even know were happening. It was a machine, and it had been running for years. She brought it up to the city housing office in a formal letter. A few days later, she received a call. The man on the line, young, polite, carefully neutral, told her that her inquiry had been noted, but that the office had no jurisdiction over the committee's enforcement actions. He suggested she retain legal counsel if she wished to pursue the matter further. She hung up with a sense of dread so deep it felt like nausea. Then came the letter about the lien. Another envelope, plain white, no return address, just the county seal. It stated that due to unpaid fines and lack of response to property compliance notices, a lien was now being placed on the land. The structure was gone, but the land still belonged to her, for now. The lien would sit like a time bomb, waiting. If she didn't pay or find a way to resolve the penalties, the county could initiate proceedings to seize the land and auction it off. They wouldn't even need a court order, just a vote from the committee. Lillian stared at the paper and realized she was no longer grieving a fire. She was being erased, pushed out, legally, quietly, and with ruthless efficiency. And unless she found a way to push back, not with emotion, but with precision, documentation, and strategy, she would lose everything. Not just the home she'd built, but the ground it stood on. The question wasn't whether someone wanted her gone. It was who and why. Lillian knew that if she didn't act quickly, she would lose not just the land, but the dignity of resisting what had clearly become a targeted expulsion. She no longer entertained the idea that this was an unfortunate mix of incompetence and coincidence. It was methodical, calculated. Someone had orchestrated a system that punished vulnerability and turned loss into opportunity. The lien was no longer a bureaucratic formality. It was the tip of a knife pressing steadily against her future. So, for the first time since the fire, she set aside her grief and moved with purpose. She needed help. Not encouragement, not sympathy, real, strategic help. She called a local legal office she remembered from her previous renovation consultations. They didn't handle property disputes, but one of the assistants gave her a name, Daniel Keene, an attorney who specialized in civil land disputes and had previously represented clients against unfair code enforcement actions. His office was modest, tucked behind a row of offices near the courthouse, but from the moment she stepped inside, Lillian felt the difference. He didn't patronize her, didn't tell her to calm down. He listened, asked precise questions, and took meticulous notes. By the end of their first meeting, he had already filed for a temporary suspension of lien enforcement and submitted a request for all committee documents related to her property. Within a week, Daniel received a partial records release, and what they found only confirmed Lillian's fears. The inspection report that justified the fine was dated 26 hours after the fire. It listed multiple violations: charred debris visible from street, no perimeter fencing, unsafe footing conditions, and the most absurd, potential fire hazard due to exposed material, which ironically referred to ash. Worse, the report had been submitted not by a city safety inspector but by a private contractor hired by the residential committee itself, a man named Brant Langley, who had a financial stake in 2 local property management companies. One of those companies had acquired 3 foreclosed properties in Lillian's neighborhood within the last 18 months. It didn't take much to draw the line between Langley's inspections and subsequent property turnovers. Still, evidence wasn't action. The committee had lawyers too, and they responded to Daniel's filings with confident, polished letters that dismissed every accusation as conspiracy-minded speculation, and accused Lillian of trying to manipulate public resources to avoid accountability. At one point, they even suggested she might have willfully neglected repairs prior to the fire, which bordered on defamation. But what infuriated Lillian most wasn't the committee's defense. It was how efficiently the system protected itself. Her insurance company, upon learning of the lien and enforcement action, froze her claim pending resolution of legal encumbrances, effectively cutting her off from the one lifeline she had been counting on to begin rebuilding. Then came the first real escalation. One afternoon, Daniel called her, his voice flat but urgent. Someone from the committee had filed a formal complaint to the state licensing board, claiming that Lillian had submitted fraudulent architectural plans for unapproved renovations on the property prior to the fire. The board was required to open a preliminary investigation, and though Daniel was confident the claim wouldn't hold water, the mere existence of the accusation could damage her standing. If it reached her professional network or clients, it could derail her entire career. The fact that she wasn't actively working didn't matter. Reputation was currency, and the committee had just reached into her wallet and scattered it to the wind. The next morning, she found a small sign staked into the corner of what remained of her yard. It read, "Unsafe. Authorized access only." There had been no notice, no warning. It wasn't from the city. It bore the committee's letterhead. But it was enough to keep curious neighbors from walking past, to keep realtors from even considering the land, to give the illusion of danger and decay. It was the kind of psychological warfare Lillian had once admired in corporate boardrooms, until now, until it was being used against her. She told Daniel everything. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen this before, albeit rarely. A loosely organized but tightly coordinated campaign to squeeze someone out without ever making it look personal. He laid it out plainly. They're not trying to beat you in court. They're trying to wear you out before you get there. Lillian began documenting everything. Every letter, every sign, every time someone walked by her motel room and stared through the window. One night she returned from a meeting with Daniel to find her room door slightly ajar. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed, except for the stack of forms she'd been organizing that morning. It was now placed neatly in the center of the table, as if someone had come in not to steal, but to send a message. "We see you. We're ahead of you." She changed motels the next day and stopped using public Wi-Fi entirely. It wasn't paranoia. A week later, Daniel's office was broken into. Nothing of value was taken. Not the computers, not the cash box, not even the backup drives. But a box containing Lillian's case documents had been opened, files scattered, notes missing. The police filed a report, but the incident was quietly labeled non-criminal disruption. Daniel replaced all his locks. Lillian replaced her fear with fury. They shifted strategy. Daniel reached out to a state ethics board while Lillian began contacting homeowners she'd found in her earlier research. People who had been fined, pressured, or forced to sell. Some were wary, others exhausted. But one woman, a retired teacher named Claire, agreed to meet. Her story was nearly identical. Her husband had passed away, and within months, she was cited for unpermitted changes to landscape grade, followed by a cascade of fines she didn't understand. When she tried to appeal, she received a threatening letter implying that failure to comply could result in further legal action. She sold the house for a fraction of its value and left the state. But she kept copies of everything. Lillian took the files to Daniel. They now had a pattern, not just with Claire, but with others whose names were beginning to surface. Daniel compiled a formal complaint to the Attorney General's office. The process would be long, he warned her, and political. But it was a start. Then came the unmarked envelope. No return address. No name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a typed message that read, "You're wasting time. There is no rebuild. Take the offer. Walk away. No threat. No signature. But clear enough." That night, Lillian drove past her property. A white SUV she didn't recognize was parked across the street. The engine was off. The driver never got out. She circled the block twice. The SUV stayed. It was still there when she drove away. The unmarked envelope was not the end. It was a pivot. A confirmation that everything Lillian feared was not only real, but dangerously coordinated. She'd crossed a threshold without meaning to, just by refusing to back down. Up until that point, the committee and its allies had acted with plausible deniability, using bureaucratic machinery to grind her down with forms, notices, technicalities. But the letter was a shift in tone. It implied intimacy, familiarity, a personal stake in her silence. It no longer felt like the slow, mechanical cruelty of a system designed to punish outliers. It felt like strategy. Someone wanted her gone, and they had grown tired of waiting. Daniel's recommendation was straightforward. Keep everything. Escalate nothing directly. No police report, not yet. Not until they could prove where it came from. His experience had taught him that pushing too soon often gave the other side room to adapt. Lillian, however, was already past the point of patience. She wanted answers, leverage, and she wanted it fast. If someone was trying to intimidate her into walking away, she needed to find out what was truly at stake. That meant knowing who was behind the curtain. She wasn't naive enough to think the committee itself, a bland collection of homeowners and part-time enforcers, was operating as some sophisticated syndicate. But she had begun to suspect that someone connected to that network had financial motives tied directly to her land. She refocused her energy on the paperwork trail. Daniel filed additional discovery motions to extract internal communications between the committee and its contracted inspectors. In the meantime, Lillian began reviewing title records, mortgage transfers, and ownership history of the properties surrounding hers. It took hours each night and the systems were outdated and disorganized, but she started to notice something strange. Several properties had changed ownership within a short window, often just weeks after code violations were issued. What struck her wasn't the sales themselves, but the patterns. Each time, the buyer was a different LLC, but the managing address was the same. One post office box in a neighboring county, tied to a holding company with a vague, forgettable name. Harland Ridge Solutions, LLC. The name meant nothing, but the scale of activity did. Harland Ridge had acquired 9 properties in the last 2 years within Lillian's neighborhood alone. 3 of those transactions had occurred less than 90 days after the owners had been cited for property violations and subjected to fines. Publicly, the company was not involved in real estate. It had no website, no employees listed, and its official purpose was marked as consulting. That was the sort of cover Lillian recognized. A shell company used to hold and transfer assets quietly. She took the information to Daniel, who cross-referenced it with public filings. It didn't take long for him to connect the dots. Harland Ridge Solutions was legally registered to a man named Trevor Klein, who, as it turned out, had been an economic consultant for municipal housing boards for over a decade. His specialty? Urban redevelopment through low-friction acquisition. a sanitized term for targeting distressed properties in gentrifying neighborhoods. Trevor wasn't listed as a member of the neighborhood committee, but his brother-in-law was. And that brother-in-law was none other than Brant Langley, the same contractor who had filed the inspection report against Lillian's property. The implications were chilling. It wasn't just a rogue committee or an overly enthusiastic code enforcer. This was a pipeline. Citations created distress. Distress created urgency. Urgency led to discounted sales. And somewhere down the chain, someone with capital scooped up the land for pennies, using a shell to hide the transaction. Her property had become a cog in someone's acquisition machine, and she had refused to break, which made her a problem. That night, she received a voicemail. No caller ID. A man's voice, calm, low, and deliberate. "No one wants this to get ugly, Ms. Woods. The land's not worth it. You've made your point. There's still a chance to walk away." There was no demand, no threat, just resignation, like someone offering her one last window before something worse followed. She played the recording for Daniel the next morning. He saved it. He didn't ask if she was scared. They both knew the answer. Daniel began building a formal complaint to the state attorney's office, including the evidence trail that connected Trevor Klein to multiple suspicious acquisitions. At the same time, he reached out to a contact in the Department of Real Estate Fraud, hoping to flag Harland Ridge's activity under civil RICO statutes. But these steps would take time, months, maybe more, and neither of them believed Lillian had that long. The lien was still in place. The fines were growing, and behind the scenes, other gears were turning. One morning, Lillian drove to what remained of her property only to find a crew of the workers unrolling fencing material along the edge of the lot. When she confronted them, they shrugged and said they'd been hired by a local maintenance subcontractor to secure the parcel. They had no idea who signed the order. She made them stop, but they left the materials behind. A quiet reminder that someone else was making decisions now. That same day, an offer arrived. A formal letter, delivered by courier, with a logo she didn't recognize. It offered $118,000 for the land, a figure just high enough to tempt someone tired, overwhelmed, and out of options. But it wasn't signed by an individual. It was from a real estate trust operating under the name Corner Fall Development. The letter contained no negotiation, no invitation for discussion, just a one-time offer, in good faith to resolve all pending conflicts. Lillian didn't even show it to Daniel before she tore it in half. The figure might as well have been a signature of guilt. That evening, she returned to the property once more. She parked across the street and sat in silence, watching the shadows shift across the burned shell of her home. Someone else was watching, too. A man in a dark gray hoodie stood several houses down, leaning against a streetlight, arms crossed, unmoving. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. But he didn't leave, either. Lillian watched him for 20 minutes before finally pulling away. Later, she learned that the state board had quietly closed the complaint about her credentials, citing insufficient merit. The silence that followed was not relief. It was a signal. The committee and its backers had recalibrated. The public campaign was over. The shadow one had begun. From this point forward, there would be no more letters, no more rules, just pressure. It was the moment everything changed, the midpoint where a legal dispute became a private siege. And Lillian understood fully that she could no longer treat this like a dispute with paperwork. She was standing in the way of someone's design, and they had resources, time, and connections. What she had left was resolve. But, as she would soon learn, that could be just as dangerous. The days following the offer were quiet in a way that didn't soothe but unsettled. No new letters, no fresh threats, no strangers watching from parked cars or street corners. But Lillian had long since stopped believing in coincidence. Silence in this context was not absence. It was calibration, a pulling back to reassess, to prepare a different tactic. She didn't relax. She doubled her vigilance. She moved again, this time to a rental apartment in a neighboring town under Daniel's recommendation. She kept the address off any official records, used a separate P.O. box for legal correspondence, and only met Daniel in person twice a week. Always in public, never on a predictable schedule. Their communication became deliberately fragmented, not out of paranoia, but practicality. By now, it was clear someone was watching. One afternoon, as she walked to her mailbox outside the P.O. Box Center, she noticed the first real shift in pressure. A man in a maintenance uniform was standing at the far end of the parking lot, smoking a cigarette. He didn't look at her, didn't move, but he was there again the next day. Different clothes, same posture. And then again, 3 days later, this time pretending to scroll through his phone, his eyes briefly catching hers before glancing away. Lillian didn't panic. She recorded the man's presence, the timestamps, the angles. Daniel took the information and passed it to a private investigator he trusted, someone who didn't advertise and had no website. The man agreed to take the case under the condition that everything would remain off paper. Within 2 days, he confirmed what they suspected. Lillian was being tailed. Not professionally, not government level, but well enough to know her routines, who she met, what routes she favored. It wasn't intimidation anymore. It was pre-theft surveillance. They were planning something. Sure enough, it came. Late one night, Daniel called her, voice grim. He'd just been served a motion filed by the committee's legal counsel, a petition for expedited enforcement of the lien due to abandonment of property. The argument was that Lillian had failed to maintain a visible presence at the lot, had obstructed committee-ordered stabilization work, and had refused reasonable offers to resolve the situation. The document was filled with manufactured facts, strategically worded statements, and omissions so deliberate they bordered on malicious. Worst of all, it included photos. Grainy, zoomed-in images of Lillian's burned property from angles she'd never taken. One showed her car parked several blocks away. Another caught her walking alone on a sidewalk, the timestamp matching the night she'd last visited the lot. They were tracking her without her knowing. They were preparing to strip the land from her under the argument that she'd left it behind. And they were making a convincing case to outsiders. Daniel filed a counter-motion within 24 hours, accusing the Committee of Surveillance and Fabrication of grounds for enforcement. But he warned her the court might not see it the same way. "It's all perception," he said, not unkindly, "and they've spent months crafting the right one." The following week, 2 of her storage units were broken into. The first had nothing of value, just salvaged materials from her renovation project, bags of plaster, outdated light fixtures. The second contained her original architectural drawings, project journals, and the physical copies of correspondence with Daniel. The lock had been picked cleanly, no forced entry. The security footage showed a figure in a cap and jacket entering the facility just after midnight using a key card, one not issued to Lillian or Daniel. The facility manager shrugged when she demanded answers. Could have been a former employee, system glitch, impersonation. Hard to say. The footage was archived for 3 days. By the time Daniel requested a copy, it had already been overwritten. The violation wasn't just physical. It was psychological. They weren't trying to take from her now. They were trying to ruin her from the inside, to rattle her, to erase her sense of safety and turn her own surroundings into enemies. That same week, the lock on her temporary mailbox was drilled through, and someone left behind a torn fragment of one of her own project blueprints with the words, "Stop Building," scrawled across it in black marker. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand justice, but Daniel's advice remained the same. Document. Don't react. Every time she had the urge to fight back directly, he reminded her that these people thrived on escalation, because it gave them permission to push harder, to cry foul when challenged, to reposition themselves as victims. Lillian's weapon had to be control, precision, a refusal to play by their terms. And then something unexpected happened. Claire, the retired teacher Lillian had previously met, called her in a panic. A man had come to her new home, not the old one, asking questions about the meeting she'd had with Lillian, about whether she had retained any documents. He'd introduced himself as a compliance officer, conducting follow-up inquiries into a historic property violation. But Claire knew better. She hadn't left a forwarding address publicly. The man had to have traced her. She didn't know how. She was terrified. That was the moment Lillian understood they weren't just going after her. Anyone associated with her was now part of the battlefield. She called Daniel and told him they needed to move faster. No more slow-burn legal strategy. She wanted exposure. Not headlines, not interviews, but light. The kind that revealed the infrastructure of this operation, the corporate shell stacking, the contract manipulation, the abuse of community codes. Daniel reluctantly agreed and began assembling a dossier that would be submitted directly to a national property oversight agency through a trusted intermediary. It wouldn't win the case, but it would make sure that someone outside the local system was watching. In the meantime, Lillian doubled her digital security. She encrypted her devices, moved her backup files to decentralized servers, and installed low-profile surveillance systems in her vehicle and home. She stopped talking openly in public spaces, avoided routine routes, and built noise into her schedule. Appointments she didn't attend, drives that led nowhere. If they wanted a ghost, she would give them one, but one with eyes wide open. Because she wasn't fighting for the property anymore. She was fighting to stay visible, to exist, and that was something they couldn't prepare for. The tipping point came not with a grand confrontation, but with a notification. A nondescript email, tucked between junk mail and a promotional flyer, informing Lillian that a public hearing had been scheduled regarding the final enforcement of the lien and potential auctioning of her property due to continued non-compliance and deterioration of neighborhood value. The date was 12 days away. The language was sanitized, legalistic, and deliberately passive, as though this wasn't the culmination of months of silent aggression, stalking, and manufactured pressure, but rather a routine procedural matter. It read like an obituary for her rights, neatly formatted and utterly indifferent. But what the authors hadn't counted on was that by the time this letter reached her, Lillian was no longer the woman they had hoped to wear down. She forwarded the email to Daniel, who confirmed that the hearing, while technically non-binding, could serve as justification for fast-track sale if left uncontested. Worse, it would be held in a private venue, a community clubhouse the committee used for internal meetings, not a municipal hall, which meant limited oversight, limited access, and a highly controlled environment. Daniel knew the game. These forums were a performance, a farce masquerading as governance. But Lillian didn't care. She was going. In the days that followed, she prepared not just legally, but strategically. With Daniel's help, she compiled a precise, irrefutable timeline, records of communication, photographic evidence of her compliance, proof of insurance delay, and examples of malicious obstruction. But she also prepared differently. She contacted Claire again, who reluctantly agreed to attend. Another former resident, one who had been quietly forced out 2 years earlier, confirmed he would provide a signed statement. And while Lillian didn't chase headlines, she sent the case file Daniel had assembled to a former colleague from her architecture years, a quiet but influential consultant who now sat on the advisory board for a national housing ethics group. She didn't ask for a favor. She asked only that he read it. He promised he would. On the day of the hearing, Lillian arrived early. She wore nothing that screamed defiance, but nothing submissive either. Simple, structured, measured. Daniel met her at the entrance, calm but taut with focus. Inside, the atmosphere was staged, Folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, a water table in the corner, a podium set in front of a beige curtain with a faux wood finish. The committee members, seated like judges, wore polite expressions that didn't match their eyes. They opened with pre-scripted remarks about community interest and orderly resolution, laying the groundwork for their decision with sterile civility. Then they offered Lillian the floor, not expecting much. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't beg. She walked through the timeline with the precision of a builder explaining a blueprint. Every citation contradicted by a timestamp. Every claim diffused by record. Every manipulation countered by documented interference. The room didn't react, but they listened, because she had made herself unavoidable. Then Daniel stood. He laid out the legal risks the committee was inviting, their conflict of interest via Brant Langley, the financial trail to Harland Ridge Solutions, the allegations of document tampering and unpermitted surveillance. He didn't threaten. He stated. He reminded them that this wasn't a local squabble anymore. The file had been shared with state agencies. It was in the hands of ethics monitors. If this property was sold under false pretense, the liability wouldn't disappear with the new deed. It would follow them. For the first time, the committee looked uneasy, but the moment that cracked the room came from neither Lillian nor Daniel. It was when Claire rose from the back and, with a trembling voice, told her story, not as an argument, but as a testimony. She spoke of the pressure, the fear, the silence that followed her departure, and when she finished, she looked directly at the chairwoman and said, "You made sure I didn't have the strength to stay." But she does. The hearing ended without ceremony. No decisions were announced, just a promise to review all submissions and deliberate internally. It was theater, but the script had been ruined, the control shattered. 3 days later, Lillian received another letter. This one arrived in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked out of state. Inside was a single sentence typed in the center of the page. "You don't understand what you stopped." No signature, no threats. But this time, it didn't shake her. Because for the first time since the fire, she wasn't just resisting. She was winning. The resolution did not come with a gavel or applause. It came with silence, the kind that follows when power is forced into retreat. 2 weeks after the hearing, the enforcement petition was quietly withdrawn. No explanation, no apology. Just an administrative note entered into public record that the lien had been resolved via internal agreement. Daniel received confirmation that no further action would be taken against the property, and days later, Lillian's insurance claim, frozen for nearly 4 months, was suddenly approved in full. A settlement check arrived by courier without ceremony, with an accompanying note that simply read, "Thank you for your patience." The lot remained fenced, but the signs were removed. No workers returned. The SUV that had parked across from the ruins stopped appearing. Lillian knew it wasn't over in the broader sense. The system that tried to erase her didn't dissolve overnight. But something had shifted. Not just in the process, but in her. She had outlasted them. She hadn't exposed every player, but she had made herself unprofitable to pursue. She hadn't just saved the land. She had denied them the blueprint. She didn't rebuild immediately. Instead, she took the payout and left the lot untouched for months. Not from fear, but intention. Letting it sit vacant was her own quiet form of resistance. When she finally began reconstruction, she did it on her terms. Scaled back, self-directed, no permits outsourced, no contractors affiliated with anyone local. She worked slowly, deliberately, methodically. And when the framing went up, she stood beneath the skeleton of her new home, sunlight cutting through the beams, and finally allowed herself to breathe. She hadn't just fought for a place to live. She had fought for the right to remain.